Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
We're delighted that Professor David Livingstone's come over today, flying visit literally from Belfast, going back this afternoon. David's from the School of Geography, but also, this is at the Queen's University in Belfast, but is also a historian of science and has combined these two interests now for many years, as you may know, this whole question of space and time, and has many publications on the history and philosophy of science, really bringing these two fields together in a very, very interesting way. In fact, we've just found quite an old reprint that probably David's forgotten all about, but we happen to have it on our bookstore, Evolution, Eschatology and the Privatization of Providence. Only 30p, it's a reprint by David, which is on our bookstore, and do help yourselves to the other books there. But today, David's going to continue on the same theme that he's been building up over the years, this whole relationship between history and science and geography. And his topic is Public Spectacle and Evolutionary Theory, the Fortunes of Darwinism and the Calvinistic Cultures of Victorian Edinburgh and Belfast. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you. One other prefatory observation is that this is part of an ongoing project in which I'm trying to ascertain the significance of what you might call local cultures in the construction of scientific meanings in a popular or, well, maybe even elite set of arenas. And so this is really a case study of a larger project that I'm hoping to be engaged in over the next several years. Public spectacle and evolutionary theory in Victorian Edinburgh and Belfast. On Sunday evening, August 23, 1874, the Free Church of Scotland clergyman and professor of Hebrew, William Robertson Smith, was the guest preacher at Duncairn Presbyterian Church in North Belfast. He had been in the city for several days, and before the week was out, he would put pen to paper to engage in a journalistic spat with another visitor to the city that particular week, none other than John Tyndall. It was, of course, the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science that had drawn both men across the Irish Sea. Tyndall, of course, was there to deliver his presidential address to the British Association, and as a fully paid-up member of that scientific Masonic lodge, the X Club, he was engaged in a campaign to divert cultural authority away from the older clerical brigade and into the hands of the newly professionalised scientific fraternity. By contrast, the 28-year-old Smith had come hot-foot from a summer in Germany, Holland and Belgium to keep himself abreast of the latest scientific developments, and also no doubt to see how Tyndall would acquit himself given Tyndall's deteriorating relationship with an old friend of Smith's, and indeed a teacher of Smith's, the Edinburgh natural philosopher Peter Guthrie Tate. On the previous Wednesday, of course, Tyndall had delivered his infamous Belfast address, in which he proclaimed that science had progressively routed the forces of theological and metaphysical dogma. The city's atmosphere was electric, and the local clerical fraternity were hopping with rage. Tyndall himself later reflected, and I quote him, that every pulpit in Belfast thundered of me. For his part, Smith thought that Tyndall's lecture was simply, and I quote him, wretched. And he decided, as he told one of his friends, that he should, and I quote him again, pitch into it in the pages of the Northern Whig. Smith had clearly grasped the city's prevailing mood, for he told his readers that Tyndall's grasp of early religious history was hopelessly flawed, that his knowledge of the history of atomism was pitiful, and that his understanding of the Middle Ages was at least a century behind that of present scholarship. For his part, P.G. Tate was mightily pleased with William Robertson Smith's performance, and he dashed off a note to him from St. Andrews, congratulating him that he had, and I quote, indeed smitten Dagon in his temple. On the local front, in thus communicating his views to the press, Smith gave every impression of standing shoulder to shoulder with his Belfast co-religionists on the issue of evolution. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Now, it's the conjunction of these two figures, Tyndall and Smith, in Belfast during August of 1874 that introduces two of the key dramatis personae, if you like, in the argument that I want to develop about how Darwinism was encountered amongst Calvinists in the Calvinist cultures of Edinburgh and Belfast during the final quarter of the 19th century. The fortunes of evolutionary theory in those cities, I want to argue, were intimately bound up with the public spectacles of these two figures. Both of them were controversialists. Both of them found themselves embroiled in bitter public quarrels that made headline news. Both achieved iconic status as representing what became for many anathematized doctrines. Both were the victims of extremist publicists who misinterpreted what they had to say. The fracas in which Tyndall was swept up in Ireland and the imbroglio into which Smith was soon to be catapulted in Scotland set the stage in rather different and I think ironic ways for how evolution would fare in these two cities for more than a generation. Now, if this case study and my argument or something like it is in the right neighbourhood, then if we're trying to get a handle on the reception of scientific theories, I want to suggest that the role of iconic individuals, the significance of high-profile events, the choice of rhetorical strategies that people deployed, and the local constructions of meaning, I think these need to be accorded greater prominence in our thinking about the relationship between science and religion. So, calm before the storm. In the decade and a half after the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859, there was very little premonition in Belfast society of the turmoil that Tyndall's foray would subsequently generate. In fact, the initial response to evolutionary theory in Belfast in the years between 1860 and 1874 is conspicuous by its absence. And indeed, where any dissatisfaction was expressed, it was expressed in a very muted sort of way. Indeed, there's some evidence of support for the theory amongst Presbyterian clergymen in the years between 1860 and 1874. The Reverend George McCloskey, for example, made a few observations on Darwinism in his consideration of The Natural History of Man, an article he wrote in 1862. He welcomed natural selection as a compelling account of racial differentiation and as a means of shoring up monogenism in the face of growing polygenetic speculations. Later, he of course followed James McCosh to Princeton, where he took up the chair of natural history. The next year, another clergyman, William Todd Martin, also expressed some reservations about the Darwinian theory of development, but these were indeed very muted, as I've said, and there was nothing of the kind of furore that would later develop in the years after 1874. So I think we could say that in Belfast, prior to the 1870s, support for Darwinism was judicious, criticism lacked vitriol. Things were to dramatically change during the winter of 1874. Now, across the Irish Sea in Edinburgh, early appraisals of biology were, if anything, rather more negative than they were in Belfast. Within a year of the publication of The Origin of Species, a Free Church minister in Edinburgh, John Dunce, in 1864, later in 1864, he would move to take up the position of Professor of Natural Science at the new college. He issued his judgment, and I quote him, that until some tapir should be caught in the act of becoming a horse, Darwin's theory remains unsubstantiated. David Brewster took much the same line. Principal of the University of Edinburgh since 1859 and a distinguished experimental physicist, also an elder in the Free Church, Brewster found, and I quote him, way too much wild speculation and too much fancy in The Origin of Species. And indeed he was disturbed to have to report that the name of the creator, and I quote him, is never distinctly mentioned. Now, no doubt those negative sentiments were further stirred by the visit of Thomas Henry Huxley to give 2 lectures on Darwinism to Edinburgh's working classes in the Queen Street Hall in January of 1862. Before a packed audience, Huxley attacked the biblical account of creation and declared that humans were descended from the same stock as apes. That threw the Witness, which was the Free Church magazine, into paroxysms of rage. Huxley, so its readers learned, had promulgated, and I quote, the vilest and beastliest of doctrines. Huxley, for his part, was mightily pleased. He revelled in what he called the large and liberal cursing that I've received from the Free Church, and added in a letter to Frederick Deister that life has its joys, my son, if we can but earn them. The following year, the explorer Paul de Chaillu also turned up in Edinburgh to talk about his African experiences. Armed with a gruesome cargo of disembodied heads, he titillated his audience with theatrical displays of stuffed gorillas and drew lurid parallels between apes and, quotes, savages. The monkey-to-man theory hung in the air, and it remained in the memory of the Reverend Thomas Smith, who in a lecture to the United Presbyterian Congregation in 1867 sneered at the idea of a gorilla transmuting into a human. Taken overall then, the response of Edinburgh Calvinists to evolutionary theory was, I think, more negative than their Belfast counterparts, a stance no doubt confirmed by the geophysical estimates of the Earth that were coming from Lord Kelvin, William Thompson, who periodically worshipped in a Free Church congregation in Largs. By the final quarter of the 19th century, the relative equanimity that Belfast Calvinists had previously displayed in the response to Darwin evolution had hardened into implacable opposition. Whereas in Edinburgh, by contrast, opposition declined in exactly the same period, as the theory became widespreadly adopted amongst theological leaders. And the question is, why? I think that two public and prominent events during the 1870s in Belfast and Edinburgh, each centering on matters to do with scientific scholarship, were critically important in shaping the dialogue for at least two generations. Let's turn first to Belfast. John Tyndall, of course, there he is, was an Irishman, and therefore always ready for a fight. Maybe I should revise therefore. He was an Irishman and was ready for a fight. It was precisely because he felt that his Belfast audience didn't want him to be there that he determined to be, what he said in a letter to Huxley, that he would be less tender than he might otherwise have been. He may have wished that he hadn't let Huxley talk him into the whole business, but he decided not to listen to Huxley's advice to be wise and prudent. His 1874 address was like a gunshot that echoed round the world. It prompted Bernard Shaw to put into the mouth of one of his female characters the comment, "Nothing has been right since that speech that Tyndall made at Belfast." The thrust of Tyndall's attack, of course, is well known. Advocating what he called a higher materialism, he sought to restrict the scope of religion to the realms of the private and to the realm of the emotional, and to leave scientific inquiry free from the constraints of metaphysics. In the interpretation of the nature of nature, if you will, he maintained that scientists must hold unhindered sway. So began Belfast's winter of discontent. The following Sunday, Robert Watts, clergyman and professor of theology, already smarting from the fact that the British Association had rejected an ironic paper on science and religion that he had proposed, he came out that following Sunday with guns blazing. To him, it was the moral implications of Tyndall's Epicurean materialism that most stung, and he forecast the downfall of any culture that adopted it. The full details appeared the next week in the Presbyterian weekly newspaper, The Witness, and a pamphlet which sold 5,000 copies inside a month. None of my books have ever been able to do that. Very quickly followed. The refusal of both Tyndall and Huxley, moreover, to engage Watts in a local public debate, a challenge which he issued on the 27th of August that year, added to Watts' standing and to their notoriety in the Calvinist city of Belfast. Something had to be done. As the editor of The Witness put it at the end of August, quotes, "We now know exactly the state of matters and what is to be expected from Professor Tyndall and his school, and we shall be able to take our measures accordingly." The Belfast Calvinists led their plans. At the next monthly meeting of the Presbytery, the Reverend William Johnson took the floor. A fortnight ago, he declared, Tyndall had assaulted, quotes, Christianity in its vital parts. Through its presidential address, he noted, and its bigoted rejection of Watts's peace offering, the British Association had made itself, and I quote, a party to a one-sided attack on Christianity. Johnson, moreover, was determined that his remarks would not lie dormant in the pages of the Presbytery's minute book. And so a couple of weeks later, he met with a few fellow clergy to lay plans for a whole series of winter lectures on the relationship between science and religion. In due course, the resulting pamphlets would be gathered together into a book with an introduction by Johnson himself. 8 clergymen and 1 scientist, David Moore, who was the Glasnevin Botanical Gardens director in Dublin, took part. The first lecture was by J.L. Porter, who later became Vice-Chancellor of the Queen's University of Belfast, as it subsequently became known, and it was an Orientalist traveller and indeed a theologian. He castigated the crude speculations and wild conjectures of both Tyndall and Darwin, and urged that the origin of species' persistent confusion of fact and theory rendered it a logical disaster. William Todd Martin was troubled by the thought of the influence that an impersonal force, whatever that meant, would have on morality and religion. A scary eugenic set of experiments in what he called the direction of a higher development of organism and intelligence, he wrote, might be attained by careful scientific oversight of the question of population. There's a very early worry, I think, about eugenics, already surfacing in the early 1870s. This winter series of lectures on science and religion was plainly intended to enable the Calvinist leadership to gain control of the debate that Tyndall's materialism might trigger. The fact that several of the speakers actually made no reference to scientific questions whatsoever, as they treated subjects like tradition, scripture, and Christology, simply attests to the fact that this Presbyterian community and this Presbyterian hierarchy felt the need to systematically reconfirm their doctrinal boundaries in the wake of Tyndall's assault. The winter series was nothing less than a concerted effort to set the terms in which conversation about evolution in Belfast had to be conducted. Tyndall's rhetoric made it virtually impossible for any mediating positions to be heard. Even while their fellow Presbyterians in Ulster were reeling from Tyndall's attack in 1874, there were signs among the Scots in Edinburgh of a rather more positive assessment of evolution. Robert Rainey, in his inaugural address to the new college students, Church of Scotland College, that same winter, confidently declared that if evolution were to be established, and I quote him, it would have absolutely no bearing on the arguments of the theist. As the century wore on, other voices were added into the book. Robert Flint, who moved from St Andrews to assume the divinity chair in Edinburgh in 1876, worked hard to develop an evolutionary natural theology. So too did the United Presbyterian clergyman Henry Calderwood. In 1881, he insisted that Darwin's theory had found a permanent place in biological science, and later went on to say that evolution stands before us as an impressive reality in the history of nature. To be sure, there were some dissenting voices, but these were remarkably muted now in contrast to what had happened prior to 1874. Now I want to turn to the role of William Robertson Smith in this culture of late 19th century Scotland, and Edinburgh in particular, to ascertain the significance of his role in these changing attitudes. Born in 1846, the sparklingly brilliant Robertson Smith disclosed precocious abilities in science, mathematics, and languages, and entered the University of Aberdeen as a student at the age of 15. Besides a variety of theological essays, he had already published a range of scientific papers on geometrical reasoning, fluxions, and the flow of electricity by the time that he was appointed at the age of 24 to the chair of Hebrew and Old Testament at Aberdeen's Free Church College. Amongst his other exploits must be numbered his various travels in the Arabian Peninsula, often in Arab dress, and on one occasion an interesting 11-day excursion with none other than Richard Burton. And what an interesting encounter that must have been. It was, however, in 1875 that his entry on the Bible for the Encyclopaedia Britannica propelled Smith into the public limelight. For here he showed his enthusiasm for the German biblical criticism of Julius Wellhausen. At first, only ripples of discontent were discernible, mostly from the review that Archibald Charteris, Professor of Biblical Criticism at Edinburgh, penned for the Edinburgh Courant. But the issue was seized upon by the well-known Free Church preacher James Begg, and charges of heresy were brought against Smith in 1878. The matter rotated around such questions as the dating of the Levitical laws, the authorship of Deuteronomy, and various issues about the accuracy of the biblical documents. Initially, the General Assembly acquitted Smith of the charge, but within a short space of time he again found himself arraigned on the interpretation of the Pentateuchal documents. And again, though he was admonished by the moderator, he was not subject to any discipline. A few days after the end of the latest hearing, in 1880, however, his piece for the 11th volume of the Encyclopaedia Britannica on Hebrew language and literature appeared in print, perpetuating the same critical outlook. While it had obviously been prepared long before the last meeting of the Church's General Assembly, its point of publication gave every impression of a downright flaunting of the Church's authority. Moreover, and I think this is critical, in April of 1880, Smith had been in Italy and visited his long-standing friend John Ferguson MacLennan, Scottish lawyer and parliamentary draftsman. MacLennan had already, in his 1869 to 1870 examination of the topic of the worship of animals, had put forward a theory of totemism in which a natural object was supposedly adopted by a tribal group as an emblem of the clan. Earlier still, he had advanced in his Primitive Marriage title of 1865 an extraordinary account of the matriarchal and polyandric origins of civilization, ultimately rooted in the unintended consequences of female infanticide. Now, William Robertson Smith took these theories and applied them to the Bible in an essay on animal tribes and animal worship in the Old Testament. Here he asserted, and I quote him, that his results are remarkably confirmatory of Mr. MacLennan's theory, a theory that had been framed almost absolutely without reference to the Semitic races. This assertion aroused even greater horror at the General Assembly, which appended the following comment to its resolution, and I'll read it verbatim. First, concerning marriage and the marriage laws in Israel, the views expressed by Robertson Smith are so gross and so fitted to pollute the moral sentiments of the community that they cannot be considered except within the closed doors of any court of this church. Clearly they got to read it, but nobody else would. Secondly, concerning animal worship in Israel, the views expressed by the professor are not only contrary to the facts recorded and the statements made in Holy Scripture, but they are gross and sensual, fitted only to pollute and to debase public sentiment. In consequence of all this, Smith was formally deposed on the 26th of May 1881 from his chair. He subsequently assumed general editorship of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, held the post of librarian here at Cambridge, and eventually in 1889, just 5 years before his untimely death at the age of 45, succeeded to the Thomas Adams Chair of Arabic here at Cambridge University. Now, as the public spectacles of Tyndall's goading Ulster Presbyterians in their own den, and Robertson Smith's scholarly martyrdom at the hands of the Free Church, I believe these rocked the Calvinist cultures of both Belfast and Edinburgh to the very core of their being. In different ways, they set the stage for the respective traditions' treatment of evolution during the final 2 decades of the 19th century. So, the post-histories of these two dramas that I've been trying to outline for you for just a little while now serve to expose, of course, a number of ironies in the story, and to redraw attention to the role of local circumstances in the shaping of a culture's encounter with at least certain scientific theories. At the same time, they also disclose the diverging intellectual trajectories of the arch-conservative Watts and the dissenting radical Robertson Smith. Robert Watts, who he is, had a long memory. And so long as that Tyndall event could be recalled, it was extraordinarily difficult for Belfast Calvinists to express much sympathy for evolution. When the Pan-Presbyterian General Council convened in Belfast a decade after the BA meeting in June of 1884, Watts's attitude of no surrender remained resolute. Whereas visitors like George Matheson, Henry Calderwood, and John Mono all spoke of the ways in which Christianity and Darwinism could be harmonized, Watts utterly dismissed evolution as a mere hypothesis with not one single particle of evidence, unquote, to support it. When Calderwood spoke warmly about the possibility of finding God lurking behind Spencer's unknowable, Watts must have shaken his head in despair, for he had long been on a campaign against Spencer's system as a strategy to subvert Scripture. Other Belfast colleagues concurred. Todd Martin, disturbed at Calderwood's flirtation with the Spencerian theology, produced a book-length rebuttal in 1887 in which he repeatedly pressed the conjectural nature of speculative Spencerianism and judged that it would be theologically irresponsible to embark on any doctrinal reconstruction. Needless to say, these writers had no patience with Henry Drummond, and the ever-watchful Watts had Drummond in his crosshairs as soon as Drummond's Natural Law in the Spiritual World was published. Like Horatius Bonner, who snapped that Drummond was, quote, deadly poison, Watts considered Drummond's project to evolutionize theology nothing short of despicable. By now, of course, Watts had grown entirely disillusioned with the compromises of his Edinburgh Calvinist colleagues, and in particular the New College network. And so he began to cultivate links much more assiduously with another space, Princeton Theological Seminary in the United States. In introducing a student to the Princeton campus, for example, he wrote to the theologian B.B. Warfield in 1893, and I quote, "I dread the influence of the Scotch theological halls," he says. Of course he had in mind figures like Marcus Dodds, A.B. Bruce, and most of all the outrageous Robertson Smith. Dodds, for his part, was appalled and quipped that Watts was, and I quote him, "one of those unhappily constituted men who cannot write unless they are angry." Moreover, a full 20 years later, 20 years after Tyndall's Belfast address, he was still recalling the event and complaining about its lingering influence. The Tyndall episode remained unsullied in Watts' mind, and he neither would nor could relinquish his grip on that bitter memory. He was not alone. The medical practitioner Samuel B.G. McKinney of Sentry Hill to the north of Belfast repeated as late as 1895 many of the self-same objections to evolutionism that had wended their way through the winter series more than 20 years earlier. McKinney, of course, had been a student at Queen's College and then in Edinburgh during the late 1860s and early 1870s, and he was crystal clear in his rejection of evolution. I quote a medical practitioner, "The weakness of the theory lies in the absence of any foundation of fact." Indeed, he brought forth another criticism of Darwinism which in all my reading of the 19th century I hadn't come across before, and I wonder will it be as novel to you as it turned out to be for me some weeks ago when I discovered it. I read, "A glance at any photograph of Darwin is sufficient to convince anyone that his brain was so imperfectly developed that he was not naturally capable of exhibiting any higher functions of mind, and could only be a keen observer of facts and a steady plodder in experiments. Even his experiments on the influence of worms were due to the suggestion of another. He originated nothing." Of course, it wasn't only Calvinists who perceived dangers of epic proportions in Tyndall's onslaught. Irish Catholics were no less perturbed. Even before Tyndall had set foot in Belfast, the Catholic Irish ecclesiastical record had berated what it called the Moloch of natural selection for its ruthless extermination of unsuccessful competitors, for its empirical flimsiness, and for its repugnant moral ramification. To them, the latest collision in Belfast only confirmed in the minds of the Catholic hierarchy that this most recent incarnation of materialism unveiled yet again, and I quote them, "the moral and social doctrines that lurked in the gloomy recesses of science's speculative theories." You see, to them, on a Tyndall or Darwinian reading, morality became a mere chimera. Virtue and vice were nothing but the expressions of what they called the same mechanical force. Religious sentiments were the result of nothing but interactions between organisms and their environment. Such was the brutalizing materialism, the Catholic hierarchy insisted, that now confronted the Irish people. That same winter, in the Irish Monthly, another writer traced Tyndall's materialism to Germany, that land of foolish philosophers. The congruence between Catholic and Calvinist evaluations of Tyndall in Belfast is palpable. But Ulster sectarianism ensured, of course, that rather than fostering a united resistance, the Tyndall event simply became another occasion for both sides to fire shots at each other. Watts, wriggled to try to distinguish his reservations from those of his Catholic neighbours, contended that, believe it or not, it was pitiful to observe the position taken by the Catholic hierarchy of Ireland in their answer to Tyndale and Huxley. Of course, the Irish Catholic leadership also took their chance of attacking the Protestant philosophy of state education. The prevailing circumstances, they declared, justified, and I quote, to the full the determination of Catholic Ireland not to allow her young men to frequent universities and colleges where science is made the vehicle of materialism. Accordingly, the Catholic bishops and archbishops rebuked, and I quote them, the indifference of those who may be tempted to grow slack in the struggle for a Catholic system of education. Tyndale's speech, it seems, succeeded not only in fostering the opposition of both Protestants and Catholics to Tyndale's science, but it furthered their antagonism to each other. The public nature of Tyndale's materialist manifesto in Belfast made it more difficult for Belfast Calvinists to negotiate the sort of conceptual arrangements that were able to be effected by Calvinists in other places. In such an atmosphere, they could only see the folly of acceding to the accommodationist strategies of their Edinburgh counterparts. To the contrary, these newer compromises only seemed to confirm them in the rightness of the belligerent path on which they had embarked a decade or more earlier. As for conditions across the Irish Sea, William Robertson Smith, whose theology was speculative, it made biological evolution seem intellectually tame. So radical was Robertson Smith's theology that it seems to me that Scottish Calvinists spent their time attacking his theology rather than worrying so much about the evolutionary views that were forthcoming in the final quarter of the 19th century. The irony, of course, is that Robertson Smith displayed a more profound engagement with evolution than any of the pro-evolutionists in Edinburgh ever really did. So let's turn for my last few minutes to Smith, the documentary hypothesis, and the anthropology of sacrifice. Even though Smith repudiated Spencerian evolution and abominated the materialism of Tyndale, there's good reason to suppose that he actually absorbed more comprehensively evolutionary values than any of his pro-evolution colleagues in the Free Church tradition. Have I done something to bring this noise on? No.
So,
Noise?
yeah, I think so.
No, okay.
Try making the slide go back and forward again.
Do you think that might have something to do with it? Yeah?
Is there a noise?
No, it's not.
Thank you for the suggestion.
No.
It's selected out, I fear. Indeed, several years before he crossed swords with Tyndale in Belfast, Smith had advertised his enthusiasm actually for an evolutionary reading of scriptural history. As Keith Whiteland observes, the notion of evolutionary progress runs as a dominant thread through Smith's writings, colouring his attitude to religion, society, and history. In short, it underpins every aspect of his thought. In the long run, of course, Smith's project to persuasively apply scientific method to theological studies, and thereby to deliver a scientific defence of Christian theism, would lead him very far into the territory of source criticism, radical anthropology, and speculative prehistory. It would, of course, bring him to the admiring attention of the likes of Emile Durkheim and Sigmund Freud. Smith's 1887 Burnet Lectures at Aberdeen, published as The Religion of the Semites, are illustrative. Here, having already expanded on the role of female deities and polyandry in what he called Semitic heathenism, he fastened on the role of sacrifice in delivering to a worshipping community what he called an age-old liminal experience of communion between the human and the divine worlds. To Smith, prehistoric practices of sacrifice were bound up with the primordial belief that the bloody wolfing down of the gobbets of throbbing flesh, this is George Elder Davies' colourful language, the gobbets of throbbing flesh newly killed of one of their fellow tribesmen, served as a kind of social refreshment of an Aboriginal sense of tribal identity and clan union. It was what Smith called this primitive act of cannibalistic Sacrifice, he described it as an act of social fellowship. Amazing. As Huber and Mouse summarized it, in the view of Robertson Smith, sacrifice was a meal at which the devotees, by eating the totem, assimilated it to themselves, were assimilated to it, and became allied with each other or with it. Sacrificial slaughter, they went on, had no other object than to make possible the devouring of a sacred and consequently forbidden animal. Later Hebrew sacrificial ritual, though purged of the orgiastic excesses of this primitive gorging, was nonetheless rooted, according to Robertson Smith, in some form of sublimated cannibalistic social memory. That Durkheim and Freud found this account compelling is hardly surprising. Durkheim confessed that his own recognition of the crucial role played by religion in social life was largely due, and I quote him, to reading the works of Robertson Smith. As for Freud, his enthusiasm sprang from his psychoanalytic interest in taboo and totem, in this case a totem meal, and in the profound sense of ambivalence that attended a ritual in which the very thing most revered, divinity incarnate, was ceremonially slain. To be sure, Freud developed Smith's exegesis in ways that the Scotsman would hardly have welcomed or probably even understood. Whereas Freud read the sacrificial act as expressing a deep-seated psychological equivocation and drew out sexual elements that rotated around his notion of the Oedipus complex, Smith rather connected the whole affair to a growing awareness in human society of real sin, real guilt, and thus a real need for atonement. After all, Smith had long insisted that, as he put it in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, in an entry on sacrifice, these piacular forms contained from the first germs of eternal truths. Indeed, he hoped that he would live long enough to write a book that would show to the world, as he said, the divine revelation of God in the Old Testament. Durkheimian and Freudian enthusiasm notwithstanding, what attracts me to this event, or this series of publications in the present context, is the fact that Smith's account of Semitic ritual was grounded in a thoroughly evolutionary understanding of religion as a developmental social formation. And what is particularly significant are the fundamentally Christian assumptions that were built into Smith's evolutionism. To be sure, enlightenment of ideas of progress doubtless contributed, as did Victorian conceptions of biological evolution. But the influence of Christianity itself was of paramount importance. As Beidelman astutely observes, evolution makes sense if one believes, as Smith did, in a chosen people for whom truths were slowly revealed over a long period of time. Thus Smith saw the Jews as gradually evolving from a period of ignorance about God's plan for them through ever higher forms of moral awareness, with Christian revelation representing the evolutionary peak. Not only was Christianity an improvement on Judaism, but for Smith, Presbyterianism was a higher form of Christianity than Roman Catholicism. In setting out his methodological wares in the religion of the Semites then, it's not at all surprising that Smith should repeatedly use evolutionary vocabulary. He spoke of arrested development in the evolution of Semitic society. He spoke of the changing connections between religion and kinship depending on the stage of social development. He spoke of the need to link more advanced ideas with a higher state of social development. Clearly, whatever his reservations about Tyndall's or Spencer's renditions of evolutionary theory, Smith emphasized the emerging properties of evolving religion and the progressive nature of divine revelation. Thus, in his 1881 lectures published as the Old Testament in the Jewish Church, he directly linked the different phases of Hebrew ritual culture with Israel's developing social economy. Thank you. In sum then, evolutionary motifs facilitated Smith's inclinations towards both biblical criticism and primitive anthropology. As Beidelman confirms, nearly all of his writings were cast in some developmental form, whether it was a report of the increasing refinement and progress of biblical scholarship or on account of the evolution of ancient Semitic kinship organization. Now, however much Smith thought he was using modern scholarship to shore up Christian theology, and indeed he believed to the end of his days that he'd said nothing contrary to the Westminster Confession of Faith, William Robertson Smith did nothing but strike terror to the heart of the conservative wing of the Scottish Calvinist tradition. Disturbed as they were to the very centre of their cultural being, these Calvinists directed their collective energies to weeding out what they saw as Smith's importation of rank profanity from Germany, that fountain of all poison, as the Reverend Alex McCraw called it in The Scotsman. This was the front on which battle needed to be engaged, and it was in this context that Darwin's biological theory just seemed comparatively tame. Just as the Tyndall event in Belfast made it extraordinarily difficult for Belfast Calvinists to express much enthusiasm for Darwin, the Smith debacle made it relatively easy for their Edinburgh counterparts to speak warmly of evolutionary biology. But the irony is palpable. Even as Smith's opponents denounced what they took to be his monumental heresy, they adopted in one form or another the very theory that animated Smith's entire project, evolution. Of course, the textual implications that Smith elaborated were often not perceived by theological advocates of biological transformism. In his biography of Henry Drummond, for example, George Adam Smith, who was actually Robertson Smith's successor, noted that despite Drummond's enthusiasm for evolution, quotes, as an eternal principle, and despite Drummond saying that evolution was, and I quote him, the century's noblest contribution to theology, George Adam Smith did go on to say this: nonetheless, Drummond failed to see how to apply the principle of development to the origin of Scripture itself and to the story of Revelation. Whatever Robertson Smith's disquiet over Tyndall's evolution, it's clear that a vivid evolutionary imagination, derived in part from the social evolutionism of John McLennan, in part from an enlightened Christian progressivism, these energized his championing of both the documentary hypothesis and his archaeoanthropology of primitive religion. A quick word in conclusion, and I'll be on 45 minutes.
Exactly.
The fortunes of evolutionary theory in the Calvinist cultures of Belfast and Edinburgh, I want to suggest, were intimately bound up with these two public spectacles: Tyndall's militant attack on metaphysics in Belfast, and Robertson Smith's arraignment on charges of heresy in Edinburgh during the 1870s. In Belfast, the aggressive campaign of the evolutionist Tyndall in the cause of scientific expertise liberated from ecclesiastical authority simply rendered any ironic accommodationism to evolutionary biology virtually impossible. Rhetorical exuberance on all sides made hearers tone deaf to mediating voices. The seeming subversion of the age-old authority of Scripture and the naturalizing of key elements in Semitic religion that landed Robertson Smith in the ecclesiastical courtroom shook the foundations of Edinburgh's Calvinist culture. Compared to the project on which he was embarked, and given the Free Church's long-standing devotion to empirical science, Darwinian biology seemed to pose no threat of momentous dimensions, even though, ironically as I've said, Smith was engaged in nothing less than expanding the scope of evolution's empire to encompass the textual and doctrinal history of Judeo-Christianity. My conclusion is this: the fate of evolutionary theory in Belfast and Edinburgh was shaped by the contingencies of cultural politics at the time, the spectacle of public theatre in newspaper headlines, the cadences of rhetorical inflection, what people felt they could say and what they felt they couldn't say, and moreover also the struggle over the local exercise of moral authority. 47 minutes later.
Thank you very much, David. Well, I'm sure that's stimulated some questions. So who wants to kick off? Maybe I'll start. I'll take Chairman's prerogative. I mean, you mentioned Princeton a couple of times. Can you just, in a nutshell, what was different about Princeton? Because they had Presbyterians who also accepted evolution very warmly. Is it that they didn't have the same figures of rhetorical controversy who were there and somehow it had an easier passage, or what happened there? So,
well, that's a very interesting set of questions. I have worked on the Princeton response over the years. To slightly caricature it, I would say that the Belfast Calvinists repudiated for more than a generation Darwinism as I've described. I think that the Edinburgh Calvinists warmly embraced it after the first couple of decades of uncertainty. I would say that Princeton took a mediating position. That is to say, in the Princeton tradition, provided the notion of teleology could be retained and a kind of evolutionary natural theology developed, I think that the vast succession in the Princeton theological tradition were happy to accommodate that modified form of Darwinism. When you read the works of the Princeton theologians, what is interesting is that concerns about evolution's challenge to the detailed textual evidence in Genesis is conspicuous by its absence. There's a philosophical objection, and provided the issue of teleology or purpose could be satisfactorily resolved, they were quite happy to accept evolution as a portrait of how transformism might have taken place. And I think one interesting fact here is this, that the celebrated, this is not widely known, the celebrated Princeton theologian B.B. Warfield, who I think becomes the key mouthpiece for the accommodation that Princeton made to evolutionary theory, was from Kentucky. And for a couple of years before he returned to Princeton as a theologian, he had been the editor of the lecturer of the Kentucky Livestock Breeding Journal, because his father, of course, was involved in horse breeding. And he confesses, as did his father, who wrote a book about breeding, encountered evolution, as it were, in the feedlot when he was trying to get the best particular breeds. So in much the same way that Darwin relied upon domestic pigeons for understanding the mechanism of natural selection, Warfield had experienced this firsthand in his father's farm back in Kentucky, and I think that might be a crucial ingredient in him moving towards an evolutionary reading. So I think those are some of the differences. I would say they were less wholehearted in their embracing of evolution, but they embraced it nonetheless. So that's how I would see the Princeton tradition.
Thank you very much. Yes. Questions to the back? Yes.
You spoke about Irish Catholics.
Yeah.
Do we have a microphone?
Yes.
Yeah. So can you just hold on a minute? We should have a roving mic. Do you know if we have a roving mic?
I've got one. Could
Yeah.
someone?
We just need somebody to run around with a mic. So I'm sorry, otherwise the questions won't get picked up. So thank you. Thank you. Right. Just wait until the mic arrives. So yeah. Thank you.
You spoke about the response of Irish Catholics by way of comparison. What was the response of Irish Anglicans at the time, particularly to Tyndall's speech?
Yeah. Well, I haven't worked extensively. The question, just to repeat it, is what about Irish Anglican responses? I want to say two things. First of all, I've tried to restrict myself pretty much to Belfast responses, because there's a very interesting story about how Calvinists in Dublin responded to Darwin, which I think is different from what happens in Belfast, and indeed different again from what happens in a place like Derry. So I'm getting pretty local about this. As for Anglican responses, in Belfast, the key Anglican response that I found at the time was from a man called John Joseph Murphy. Now, Murphy was a prominent Anglican layman, and wrote several books, even though he was an amateur naturalist, on matters to do with natural history and so on. Interestingly, his attitude moves from, in the 60s, a sort of modified version of evolution, probably more a Lamarckian notion of evolution, given the importance of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, to become more and more skeptical of Darwin's proposal of evolution solely by the means of natural selection. Now, partly this is attributable, I think, to his own empirical work, because that old objection that we still hear over and over again about how can you get a natural selection explanation for the evolution of the eye was first put forward by John Joseph Murphy. And as a matter of fact, there's a footnote in a later edition of The Origin of Species where Darwin actually refers to John Joseph Murphy's correspondence and indeed publications. But interestingly, he progressively moved away from being less evolutionary and certainly less Darwinian as the years went on. I suspect the story is very different in Dublin. largely because of the writings of Archbishop Whately, but I haven't really looked at that in the detail that I would need to do to make these kinds of comparisons. My suspicion is that the Tyndall episode was at least as troublesome to relatively conservative Anglicans in Belfast as it was to both Catholics and Presbyterians.
Thank you. Yes, question down the front, I think. So. If you could just wait for the mic, it's just coming. Yes, thank you. Yes.
I imagine that Smith must have been a contemporary of Colenso.
Yeah.
Did they have any discussion?
I have not found any evidence of the links between Smith and Colenso. I mean, I think that a lot of his Colenso was a bishop in Africa at this point in time. I think that he's drawing much more directly from the German scholarship and indeed the more general continental scholarship of Wellhausen, Graf, Kuhnen and people of this sort. I found no evidence in what I've seen of Robertson Smith, but I haven't read, of course, all the papers, of much writing about Colenso or indeed essays and reviews, which I think would be the other significant 1860 event here. I think that he's deriving it more directly from continental German and some degree Dutch sources. But I think also, and I've tried to argue this elsewhere, that his experience of travel in the Arabian Hijaz with, as I say, the colourful Robertson, with the colourful Burton, might also have been quite significant here, because he was really looking at practices of sacrifice and atonement in what he would have called, now this is his vocabulary, not mine, in Semitic heathenism. And he could see evidence of what in the 19th century were known as anthropological survivals of earlier forms of ritual practice and so on. But I think he was doing this not in a kind of Edward Said way to other the Arabian world, but rather to do an archaeology of his own Eucharistic convictions in a free church in Aberdeenshire. So I have not found much direct connection with Colenso, essays and reviews, and what Robertson Smith has to say. But that he is perpetuating in perhaps even more radical way the same outlook, I find absolutely no doubt.
Thank you. Yeah, no questions. I know, David, this is the question that one should never ask historians at the end of this talk, but as a biologist I can ask it, and you're a geographer. So, but I mean, it does sound as if there are some lessons to be drawn for today in terms of the rhetorical presentation of Darwinism and its reception. I mean, do you want to reflect on that a bit, or is that an unfair question? I mean, you know, so...
Well, it's both an unfair question, and I will reflect on it a bit.
Okay, I was hoping you'd say that, yes.
I mean, how can I comment? Well, I mean, this is part of a project that I've been trying to engage in to do with the rhetoric of the public presentation of theories, and in order to stay alive, I've been, using historical examples, always a safer kind of route. But I mean, who could doubt for a minute that public dramatic presentations of debates between science and religion have been shaping public opinion in this country for good or for ill, and therefore to somehow think that it's simply a matter of religious and scientific communities together in a kind of cool, enlightened, rational fashion, sitting down and looking at the facts, has been immensely muddied by the rhetorical strategies that are, I think, currently being employed. And I mean, I think that a study of the rhetoric of these debates is the case going right back to Galileo and the Church, and I think would absolutely be the case for understanding the Scopes monkey trial. I mean, there are many things about that Scopes trial that have been conveniently left out of the current story, such as the textbook in question was one that was advocating eugenics and also advocating higher and lower races and things of this sort. And I think right up to the debates that we have now with Daniel Dennett and Michael Roos and Richard Dawkins and so on, I'm sure that the choice of vocabulary that interlocutors are using is shaping how the debate is being presented. And whether that's always helpful or not is a very, very moot point. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, thank you.
I'm
yes.
sure others may well have
Yes.
some reflections on what I really do intend to be the wider consequences of this particular empirical study.
Yes. But it's sad that somehow the biology gets lost amidst of all the rhetoric, and that your examples seem exactly on that line. So yes. Yeah, we have time for one more question, I think, before we finish. Yes, one more at the end. Yes.
I was wondering, by what date did we get to the stage where evolution was generally accepted by pretty much everyone apart from a few creationists, not creationists?
Well, I don't think we've gotten there yet.
Well,
And a few creationists, if you listen to Ron Numbers, his most recent kind of analysis of creationism last time I saw Ron in Vancouver, it seemed to me that he was doing science religion not only globally but almost in an interplanetary sense now. I mean, everywhere. The growth of creationism, for example, in the Islamic world, this is actually quite remarkable. It's same in Africa, and I think that Ron has brought that international dimension to this. So far as my communities are concerned, other than relatively small groups, I think that amongst the communities that I've been looking at in Edinburgh and in Scotland more generally, I think this debate is really over by the 1880s. And I found many theological leaders not saying things in private, but saying things, for example, at the inaugural lecture for their students this year, or as the General Assembly and things of this sort. I think it's much more tentative in Belfast for a long period of time. And I think that's complicated by Irish history, by questions about the curriculum, about the role that the universities were going to play and be free of religious tests, not least when you think of my own university created in 1848 as part of the Royal Universities in Ireland and condemned by papal rescript that Catholics should not attend these colleges. This is the background to the formation of Newman's College, of course, in Dublin, which became University College Dublin. I think that the educational context makes a massive difference as to who's going to control the curriculum, who's going to control science, and so on. So I think in Ireland, I couldn't be at all as clear about when these debates get resolved. But I think it's much, much later than in the Scottish case for the reasons that I have been outlining here. But I don't believe for a minute that this debate is over, and I think Ron Numbers is producing this book on creationism on a sort of global scale. And as far as the demographics are concerned, it's scarcely a minority, scarcely a small group.
I mean, I think the percentage of Americans who disbelieve creationism is around 42%, isn't it? So
Yeah,
that's a pretty
big number.
big number of people. Good. Well, thank you very much, David, indeed, for taking us through some fascinating material. I want to thank David very much.
Thank you.